Otis Grange nailed the closure order over Delilah Marsh's forge while half the town watched. "By sundown, this shop belongs to the council," he announced. "A woman has no business touching the weapons men depend on." A few men laughed. Delilah said nothing. She only tightened her soot-blackened hand around her dead father's hammer. Then a blood-covered rider staggered into town. 12 raiders are waiting on the South Road," Mason Holt warned. "They're coming for the food convoy." Without those wagons, families in Red Bluff would starve before winter. Without working rifles, the town could not stop them. Grange still held out his hand. "The keys, Miss Marsh." That was when Delilah noticed something on the closure order, something that proved the forge was not being closed because it was unsafe. Someone needed it silent before the convoy arrived, and the man demanding her keys already knew why. The words that followed did not save her shop. "Raiders cut our advance rider loose 6 miles south," the stranger said. "He lived long enough to tell me there are 12 men in the cedar breaks." Delilah knew him before he pushed back his hat. Mason Holt had brought freight through Red Bluff 4 times. He was 39, tall and rangy, with gray eyes and a right wrist that never bent fully after a wagon wreck. Once he had waited 3 hours for her father to repair a reach plate without complaint. Today his gaze rested on the notice, not on Delilah's body or the hammer in her hand. Otis Grange smoothed his silver mustache. "Road stories do not concern the town council. A stolen scout horse and fresh boot blood concern whoever expects my wagons," Mason replied. 6 wagons, flour, beans, salt pork, cartridges, and the rifles ordered for the volunteer guard. The street stopped pretending not to listen. After a dry summer, 2 ranches bought meal by the cup. The convoy was not storybook treasure. It was winter measured in sacks. Grange lifted one hand. All the more reason to remove a fire hazard from the center of town. Delilah looked at the 3 names signed beneath the order. Grange's was bold. Councilman Pike's mark leaned left. Councilman Avery's signature sat below it in a stiff line. Pike had ridden north 2 days earlier to fetch his sick daughter. Avery could not write his surname without lifting the pen twice because of a crushed middle finger. The signature on the notice flowed without a break. Her father had taught her that iron spoke before it failed. Paper did too, if a person knew the hand that made the mark. "This order was not passed by a full council," Delilah said. Grange smiled as if correcting a child. "You inherited a building, Miss Marsh. You did not inherit the right to challenge lawful men." The sentence struck the old bruise cleanly. For 6 weeks, since Jonah Marsh had died beside the slack tub with his spectacles still in his pocket, men had brought horses to Delilah and asked when the new smith was coming. She had shod their teams, welded their gate straps, reset their wagon tires, and prepared 2 rifles for Fort Concho riders. They paid her, then told one another no woman could do what they had just watched her do. Delilah was 33, light-skinned, visibly obese, and broad through shoulder and waist from years at bellows and sledge. Heat freckled her cheeks, coal dust lined her palms, and her brown braid was never neat by midday. She no longer asked the town to confuse delicacy with worth. She needed the forge. Every tool carried the shape of her father's hands. Selling it would end her trade and erase the proof that Jonah Marsh had trusted her with a life's work. Grange held out his palm. "The keys." Delilah glanced past him to the hitching rail. The town marshal, Abel Wynne, stood there with his thumbs hooked outside his belt. He looked ashamed, but the brass badge on his vest still made his silence dangerous. "Did you witness the vote?" she asked. Wynne shifted. "I was told the order was proper." "That was not my question." Before he could answer, a rifle cracked from inside the council storeroom across the street. The door flew open. Young Ben Tully stumbled out holding a Winchester at arm's length, smoke curling from its action. "It fired when I closed the lever," he gasped. Mason dismounted. He did not reach for the rifle. He looked to Delilah. "May she examine it?" he asked Ben. The question quieted something inside her, not because he had deferred to her, but because he had made the town hear him do it. Ben nodded. Delilah set down her hammer, took the rifle with the muzzle turned safely into the dirt, and opened the action. The metal near the firing pin carried a bright, unnatural scratch. Someone had filed the nose too long and weakened the retaining shoulder. A hard closing lever could release it. "Who worked on this?" she asked. Grange answered too quickly. "Your father maintained the guard rifles." "Not in 6 months." Delilah held up the pin with her pliers. "This file cut is fresh." Wynne crossed the street. "Can it be repaired?" "Yes," Grange tapped the notice. "Not in a condemned shop." The decision came before Delilah felt ready. Her father had said courage was often the tool taken up because the work could not wait. She pulled the closure paper from the door. The brass tacks tore through its corners. "Then arrest me," she said. "But if those rifles fail tomorrow, do it knowing you chose the paper over the town." Grange's public calm thinned. "Marshal." Wynne looked at the rifle in Delilah's hands, then toward the south road. "I will not jail the only person who can tell me why a guard weapon fired by itself." It was not support. Not yet. But it was a crack. Mason led his lathered horse to the trough and returned with his right wrist held close to his body. "My main convoy is camped at Coyote Draw. I left 6 teamsters, 2 families, and 1 injured scout. We can turn east for San Angelo, but the Axle Road adds a day and the water barrels are low." "If the raiders know your route, they will know the east road too," Delilah said. His eyes sharpened. "That is my thought." Grange stepped between them. "Red Bluff has no obligation to shelter private freight. Take your wagons elsewhere." Mason's expression did not change. "Those supplies were purchased by this town." "Purchased," Grange said, "through my warehouse, which gives me authority to refuse unsafe delivery." There it was, the material edge beneath the insult. Grange owned the largest grain house in Red Bluff. He had advanced seed to half the county and held notes on cattle not yet sold. If the convoy vanished, hunger would raise the value of everything behind his locked doors. Delilah did not yet know whether that made him greedy or criminal. She knew only that he wanted the convoy gone and her forge silent at the same time. She turned to Ben. "Bring me every guard rifle. Do not carry them loaded." Ben looked at Wynne. The marshal nodded once. For the next hour, Delilah forgot the eyes at the door. Iron cared about temperature, stress, and time, not who held the tongs. 11 of the 14 rifles had been altered. 6 firing pins had been filed too long. 5 flat springs had been heated and allowed to cool slowly, leaving them soft enough to bend. The damage was clever because each weapon might fail differently. One could fire early, another might not fire at all. Mason stood at the bench and wrote each defect in Delilah's job book with his left hand. He did not crowd her. When her sleeve brushed the vise, he moved the lamp instead of moving her body. "This was done by someone who understood what the parts should look like," he said. "Understood enough to spoil them," Delilah answered. "Not enough to hide the color." She showed him the blue-gray band where a spring had been heated beyond safe temper. Her father taught her those colors at 12. At 16, she repaired a cavalry carbine and made the soldier test it 20 times. "A weapon is a promise," he had told her. "Never hand it back half true." At the bottom of the rifle crate lay a curl of pale wood and 2 square-headed nails. Delilah picked up one nail. Its head bore a tiny 3-sided punch. Mason saw her face change. "Yours?" "My father's mark. We use it on work charged to an account instead of paid in cash." "Whose account?" Delilah opened the old ledger. The last entry for triangle-marked horseshoes was 4 weeks earlier. 6 sets, wide heel winter cocks not yet raised. Ordered by Grange Livery. Collected after dark by Otis Grange's clerk, Lyle Pett. Horseshoes did not prove conspiracy. A livery used horses. Nails traveled in pockets. Yet Grange's marked nail inside a sabotaged rifle crate created a question that would not cool. Mason leaned over the page. My scout said the raiders rode fresh-shod animals. One threw a shoe near the south cut. Can you take me there? Yes. Then we go before the light changes. He looked at the rifles waiting on her bench. You cannot do both. I can if you work the bellows. For the first time, something almost like warmth touched his face. You have not heard me singe my eyebrows. The bellows do not require beauty. He laughed once, surprised by it, and the sound loosened the room. Delilah shaped spring stock her father had ordered from San Antonio, heated it red, quenched it in oil, polished it, then drew it carefully toward blue. Mason followed her instructions exactly, using his left hand when the right began to shake. That tremor was the first sign his limitation ran deeper than stiffness. How bad? She asked. Bad enough that I should not promise to win a shooting contest. Can you drive? A team, yes. A rifle under strain, no. He said it without pride or self-pity. Delilah respected the plainness of the admission. By late afternoon, 3 rifles were safe. She locked the unfinished weapons in her coal room, then changed from her leather apron into a brown canvas coat. Grange's closure notice lay crumpled beneath the anvil. Mason offered his horse. Delilah shook her head and harnessed her father's broad-backed bay mare to the small work cart. Riding astride for 6 miles would tire her hips before she reached the sign, and she refused to make exhaustion into a test of dignity. Mason accepted the choice without comment. They reached the south cut as sunlight flattened red across the mesquite. The road narrowed between a limestone shelf and a dry wash. One wagon wheel had gouged the shoulder where someone tested the turn. Boot marks showed men had walked the ground. Mason pointed to a dark patch. That is where they held my scout. Delilah found the thrown shoe beneath a cedar root. It was wide at the heel. One nail hole carried a burr from her father's worn pritchel, and a small triangle showed beneath the dirt. Her stomach tightened. It came from Grange's livery, she said, but any man could have hired a horse. Mason crouched beside the wheel gouge. They measured whether a freight wagon could be turned here. This is not a passing gang. Near the limestone shelf, Delilah found a splinter of green-painted wood. Grange's warehouse wagons used green sideboards. Again, not proof. Again, the same direction. A rider appeared on the ridge. Mason pulled Delilah behind the cartwheel with his left hand. The movement was protective but did not pin her. She could still see, still choose. The rider watched for 3 breaths, then vanished south. He saw us find the shoe, Mason said. Good. He looked at her. If they believe the shoe matters, they will try to take it. That tells us who's afraid of it. On the return road, Mason asked why she had stayed. Because the forge is mine? That is enough. People rarely ask what it costs to leave. 7 years earlier, a wagon had rolled while he was beneath it. The crushed wrist ended his chance to join his brother's ranch. Freight work let him use judgment more than strength. It did once, he said. Now I have to decide before trouble which promises I can keep. Delilah understood that better than she wanted to. They returned to find the forge door open. Nothing obvious was stolen. The rifles remained locked, but someone had poured sand into the oil-quench barrel and cut the leather throat of the bellows. On the floor beneath the bench lay the triangle-marked nail Delilah had carried in her coat pocket. The pocket had been sliced while she stood at the south cut. Mason swore quietly. The rider was a distraction. Delilah touched the clean cut in the cloth. Whoever had searched her had come close enough to reach her without her feeling it. Fear moved cold along her skin, then hardened into anger. Grange arrived before full dark with 2 council supporters and the marshal. Unsafe operation, he said, surveying the cut bellows. Sabotaged equipment. This is precisely why the shop must close. Delilah held up the damaged leather. A man entered while I was gone. Or your equipment failed because you cannot maintain it. Mason stepped forward, but Delilah raised one hand. This was her floor. The bellows' throat was cut from the inside with a narrow blade. The oil was fouled after I locked the door. Someone searched my coat from marked nail taken from the ambush road. Grange's eyes moved only once toward Lyle Pett. That glance was not evidence anyone else could use. It was enough to change Delilah's understanding. The closure order was not merely meant to shame her or buy the building cheaply. Someone needed the forge unable to repair weapons before the convoy arrived. "Marshal," she said, "put a man on Grange's livery and another at the warehouse." Wynne hesitated. "On what charge?" "No charge. Watch who leaves." Grange laughed. "She gives orders now?" "No," Delilah said. "I offer you a chance to prove me wrong." Wynne chose a deputy. Grange chose to escalate. At midnight, fire caught in the coal shed. Mason's fist struck the outer wall as smoke pressed beneath the rafters. Delilah pulled on boots and opened the rear door. He had freed her mare and put a wet blanket in her hands. "Your choice," he said. "Save the ledgers or help me cut the shed loose." The ledgers carried every account her father had kept for 20 years. The shed carried fire toward the forge roof. Delilah chose the shed. They hacked through 2 braces while neighbors formed a bucket line. Delilah held the wet timber while Mason sawed one-handed. The removable joint she had designed gave way, and the shed collapsed into the dirt with the worst flame. When the danger passed, Delilah found her father's oldest ledger soaked but readable. On the road behind the forge, Deputy Soria had caught Lyle Pett with lamp oil on his boots. Pett claimed he had come to help. Under questioning, he admitted moving the guard rifles from Grange's warehouse to the council storeroom. He denied altering them. He also denied collecting 6 sets of shoes until Delilah opened the job book to his signed receipt. That was corroboration, not proof of the raid. Grange could still say his clerk acted alone. Near dawn, a telegraph boy rode from the rail station 23 miles east. Mason had sent an inquiry before entering Red Bluff. The reply said Grange had reported the town's flour shipment lost 3 days earlier and demanded payment under a freight bond. The convoy had not even reached Coyote Draw 3 days earlier. The opening injustice changed shape completely. Grange had already sold the loss on paper. If the wagons arrived safely, his claim would collapse. If they vanished, he would collect the bond, cover missing grain in his warehouse, and sell what remained at famine prices. Delilah read the telegram twice, then laid it beside the rifle parts, the shoe ledger, and Pett's receipt. "Now, do you have enough?" Mason asked Wynne. The marshal shook his head. "Enough to question him. Not enough to stop 12 armed men already on the road." Delilah looked around the damaged forge. One bellows was cut, the oil barrel was ruined, half the roof dripped. 9 rifles still needed work, and sunrise had begun whitening the eastern sky. The town had denied she could run a forge. Now it needed her to run a defense. She divided the work. Mason and 2 teamsters would bring the convoy to the north pasture instead of the south street. Wynne would spread the false word that the wagons had turned east. Ben Tully would carry safe rifles only. Mrs. Avery would inventory food and keep children inside the stone church. Deputy Soria would hold Pett where Grange could not reach him. Delilah would repair every weapon she could and build 2 iron drag shoes for the lead wagons. At the narrow north approach, the shoes could lock the rear wheels and let the wagons turn into a barrier instead of rolling downhill. "That road is rougher," Mason said, "but it comes past my yard." Understanding passed between them. Her forge would become the hinge. "Grange will know," Wynne warned. "Only if someone tells him." They left Grange free, under watch, so he would believe he still controlled the road. Delilah repaired the bellows with rawhide from the harness shop. She emptied the fouled oil, scrubbed the barrel, and mixed a smaller quench in a deep iron tank. Townspeople who had never crossed her threshold now waited for orders. She gave them work without forgiving them. Councilman Avery returned just after sunrise and swore he had never signed the closure. Pike's wife produced a letter proving her husband was away. The order had carried a false signature and no lawful vote. Wynne removed the town seal from Grange's office. Delilah nailed the forged closure notice beside the door, not as authority but as evidence. For 5 hours, Mason worked the bellows until his wrist failed, then carried water and recorded tests. Delilah replaced pins, tempered springs, and test-fired each rifle. She rejected one cracked receiver. 13 safe, she said at last. 1 stays here. Ben stared at the rejected rifle. We need every gun. We need every gun not to kill the person holding it. That boundary cost them a weapon. It also taught the town what competence sounded like when fear begged for shortcuts. Mason left for the convoy. Before mounting, he gave Delilah his freight whistle. 3 short calls turn the lead teams. 1 long call sets the brakes. She closed her fingers around the brass. You are trusting me with 6 wagons. I am trusting you with the decision I cannot see from the road. He did not kiss her. He did not promise safety. He touched 2 fingers to his hat and rode. By mid-afternoon, heat shimmered above the north pasture. Delilah stood in her forge yard wearing her soot-blackened rustwork dress and leather apron. The repaired rifles rested in racks, each tagged with the name of the defender assigned to it. The iron drag shoes lay beside the road. The first wagon appeared beyond the rise. Then a shot broke from the cedar line. Mason's lead team lunged. A second shot snapped a trace. The wagon slewed sideways, blocking the others before they reached the yard. Raiders poured from the wash, expecting helpless teams and broken rifles. Delilah blew 3 short calls. The rear drivers turned as rehearsed. 2 wagons swung nose to tail. Townsmen dropped the iron shoes under the wheels and set the brakes. The improvised wall closed across the road. The defenders fired once, then held as Delilah had ordered. No wild volley, no wasted cartridges. 1 repaired rifle jammed. Ben ran it to the forge. Delilah cleared a sliver of brass, checked the action, and sent it back in less than a minute. The raiders shifted toward the alley between the forge and the grain house. That was the path Grange had promised them. Delilah saw him at the warehouse door, waving a green cloth. She blew 1 long call. Mason hauled his team against the damaged trace. His right hand failed. The leather tore free, trapping his arm between the tongue brace and wheel. The lead wagon began rolling backward toward the open flank. Delilah ran. She carried the shorter drag shoe against her chest, planted it behind the wheel, and drove its hooked edge beneath the iron tire with 3 hammer blows. The wagon stopped inches from Mason's leg. Gunfire struck the sideboard. "Can you move?" she asked. "Not until the trace is cut." She used her hot-cut chisel as a wedge and broke the buckle pin. Mason pulled free. Then, instead of sending her away, he asked, "What do you need?" "Hold the shoe." Together they braced the wheel while Ben brought a replacement pin Delilah had forged that morning. She set it through the trace bracket, locked the washer, and struck the cotter home. The wagon moved forward again. The defensive line closed. Wynne and Saria rode from behind the church with 3 ranchers cutting off the wash. Faced with working rifles, blocked exits, and no open warehouse alley, the raiders began dropping weapons. Their leader tried to reach Grange. Grange shut the warehouse door. The man shouted no confession, only 1 furious sentence. "You said her shop would be dark." It was not enough alone. It did not need to be. Inside the captured leader's coat, Wynne found a freight bond copy bearing Grange's claim number and a warehouse token used as advance payment. His horse wore one of Delilah's triangle-marked shoes. The remaining 5 marked sets appeared across the gang. Signal became corroboration. Corroboration became proof when joined to the false insurance telegram. Pets signed receipt, the sabotaged rifles, the forged council order, and the route Grange had opened through his own alley. Delilah laid every item on her workbench in the order it had been created. When Grange was brought from the warehouse, he tried the old language one last time. "You are a grieving woman who mistakes labor for judgment." Delilah placed the safe rifle beside the spoiled spring, then set the false closure notice beside Avery's true signature. "No," she said. "I am the smith who can show exactly where your work failed." Wynne arrested Grange for fraud, arson conspiracy, sabotage, and aiding robbery. 2 days later, the county judge secured the records, bond payments stopped, and missing grain was found behind a false warehouse wall. By winter, Grange awaited trial. Pett had accepted a lesser charge for testimony, and the council required recorded votes and 2 signatures on closure orders. Material repair began sooner. The convoy delivered every sack and ammunition crate. Delilah received payment for 13 rifle repairs, 2 drag shoes, 1 trace pin, and emergency work performed under fire. She charged the same rate her father would have charged, plus the cost of the bellows Grange's men destroyed. The town paid it. Some apologized. Others began calling the building Marsh Forge. Delilah trusted changed behavior more than pretty words. Mason stayed until his wrist could hold a rein without swelling. He slept in the freight office, never in Delilah's rooms, and asked before using her tools. Together they rebuilt the coal shed with a breakaway joint stronger than the old one. On the morning he left, he stood beneath the repaired sign. "I have a winter route through San Angelo," he said. "Then I return in 6 weeks, if the road holds." Delilah waited. "If I return," he continued, "may I court you?" The question warmed her more than any declaration could have. It contained no ownership, no rescue, no debt dressed as love. "You may return," she said. "We will see whether you still take instruction at the bellows." 6 weeks later, 3 short whistle calls sounded from the North Road. Delilah stepped from the forge with her hammer in one hand. Mason rode beside a wagon carrying spring steel, coal, and a new leather bellows throat she had ordered and paid for herself. He had brought no ring and made no public speech. He climbed down, looked at the line of customers waiting beneath her sign, and asked where she wanted the freight. Delilah pointed to the open door. Above it, freshly painted letters read, "Marsh Forge, Delilah Marsh, proprietor." The closure tax had been melted into a small iron rose fixed beside her name. Mason carried the first crate where she directed, and the forge fire rose behind them, not because the town had finally permitted her to work, but because it had learned the cost of standing in her way. Prairie rose here. Delilah's victory was not the moment people discovered she had value. She had value when the street mocked her, when the order covered her door, and when only her own hands remembered what her father had taught. What changed was that she refused to let fear, grief, or someone else's title decide which promises she could keep. Mason's finest act was not rescuing her. It was trusting her judgment when the lives and supplies under his care were at stake. When have you seen real competence dismissed because it arrived in a person others had already judged? Share your thoughts in the comments, and remember that respect becomes meaningful when it changes who gets heard before the danger passes.